Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this NIE Care Dialogue. I'm Charlene Rajendran, a member of the drama team at the Visual and Performing Arts in the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. And today I am delighted to be in conversation with three of my colleagues and friends who are in applied theatre and drama education as scholars and practitioners and just basically all around lovely human beings. So Selina Busby from the Central School of Speech and Drama in London, in England, Kelly Freebody from the University of Sydney, Australia, and Molly Mullen from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, or Aotearoa. Kia ora. Hello, everybody. Okay, this dialogue is the final part of a little four-part series of conversations about the importance of the arts, specifically drama, in developing justice, hope, and creativity, in which we also consider what it takes to engage meaningfully with difference and with change. And so earlier I'd spoken individually with Kelly, Molly, and Selina, and you can listen to these conversations on the NIE Care website. And I'd recommend that you do so, because today's dialogue builds on some of the emergent themes from those earlier conversations. There are also more extensive introductions to each of my colleagues and in-depth explorations about their work and their ethos as researchers, as educators, and as arts practitioners. So today I'm not going to go into that lengthy introduction, but we've come together to share these ideas and bounce off each other. And thanks to Selina for that idea and prodding us to do this across different time zones, I should say, and locations. So Auckland, where it's 8 p.m., Sydney, where it's 6 p.m., Singapore, where it's 3 p.m. right now, and London, where it's 7 a.m. So 11 hours of time zone. So that's significant in itself. So let's get the ball rolling. I'll start by saying a big, big welcome and a big thank you to all of you for making time to do this. So we've spoken a range of things that have been interrelated, even though we've spoken separately. And one in particular is that there's a strong emphasis in applied theatre and drama education on nurturing ethical relationships, on cultivating spaces where we build cohesion, we deepen social ties, we work with artistry, but we pay attention to how that is being done and the people with whom we are doing this work. And that means negotiating difference across all kinds of boundaries within and across communities, international, local boundary lines, and dealing with difference when there's an increasing climate of antagonism, this sort of fear of the other, of othering, of kind of perpetuating bias and prejudice against the so-called threat of the stranger. And then there's the challenge of working with generational change, shifting norms, what's making sense? Because at the heart of this is how do we communicate meaningfully? What is it to talk about resonance when we're changing and things around us are changing? And with the increasing use of devices, electronic devices, and more disembodiment within the polycrisis of so many different things that are generating anxiety, sense of tension, sense of real precarity, how do we navigate through this sense of change and this sense of questioning as well? So we'll start with, what are your thoughts in relation to where you are and what you are engaging with and observing and noticing, and some of the choices that you're making?
Can I jump in with I guess, a potential reframing around some of these ideas? I think it is the case, and I think most people in the world that are watching the world at the moment would say that there is increased antagonism and a reduced kind of tolerance for difference in our political spaces and in our public discourse, as nations, as communities, potentially. However, I think that it's important to also recognize that, the generation of young people that are young now, that are in schools, in our theatres, in our universities, actually are a generation that have embraced a lot of difference and a lot of tolerance in the way they use language, in the way that they speak up and for each other, in the way that they advocate for difference in society. So I think it's more complex. And I think that that makes the question more complex, Charlene, because I think that we can see that more and more social media, that these young people who have fought very hard over, generations of young people who have fought very hard, and young people that we see now who have embraced a lot of difference and a lot of change and live in a rapidly changing world. So they're becoming very, very good at embracing difference and change. But they are increasingly living in political silos, and increasingly they are not being exposed to different opinions in ways that allow them to engage or teach them to engage in productive ways. And I think that makes the generational question interesting, because I think previous generations perhaps did some of that better around, the public accepting of difference, the lack of political antagonism in spaces. But then were also at the same time less vocal and less advocating of difference and less accepting of difference in individual and family lives. So I don't know, that's not a solution or that's not even but I think it's a reframing of that question, or at least something for us to consider when we think about. I think it's too easy to simply say that this generation is seeing less tolerance for difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thanks for that, because I think what you're pointing out is that it's not binary in either sector across the different layers and across the different segments of what we are observing and experiencing. And the tendency to fall back on that very simple duality is something to avoid, within generations, across times and spaces as well. Yeah. Therefore, the complexity is enhanced. Yeah. Other thoughts?
I I think my response was to think about um, the way in which we teach and work through theatre and the arts with any generation is often about learning to kind of sit with complexity and things that are unresolvable, or the idea that there isn't only one ending, only one conclusion. Often when we're working through applied theatre and drama education methods, we're exploring multiple possible outcomes or multiple possible versions of a scenario, or speculating about multiple possible futures. And I think so there's something in that around cultivating a sensibility towards existing within complexity. And I think that's something which is really important amidst some of the challenges that you've raised, to kind of, and also the way in which theatre and the arts allow for and have aesthetic strategies for allowing different perspectives and opinions and even very different kind of paradigms or kind of knowledge systems to coexist alongside each other without one having to trump the other, excuse the word, but without one having to be the correct one. And so we can juxtapose things, we can layer things, we can, you know, use characters that represent very different perspectives without one having to win. It's not a debate. And I think that in a way is the power of the arts at this time. It's maybe we need to move away from this debate where one viewer is going to win to a situation where we're able to hold lots of different opinions alongside each other and sort of see what emerges. So yeah, I think there are some really important strategies that the arts can bring at this time for anybody, any generation. And I think I agree with Kelly that it's more complex than one generation being less able to cope with difference than another.
I think just listening to Molly talk there, it reminds me of the fact that it's a very singular experience to be in a position where you maybe playing a character or thinking about a person and the actions that they've done that you might vehemently disagree with, and to have to get into that character and embody that character and to wonder, to give yourself to motivations for doing it, not me, Kelly, having motivations for doing it, but what is the motivation of my character to undertake this action or say this thing that I actually, as a human being, might disagree with. The act of wondering, just asking yourself that question is more than we would often get to do in our interactions with people in any other space. And that in itself is an incredible experience. Thinking about what Molly just said there about, encouraging the different perspectives, understanding that there is more than one way to act here, or there's more than one reason to act in this one way. There are very few experiences that people have, that anybody has, but I'm thinking about young people because I'm a teacher, right? That young people are given in schools where they get to do that really actively, where they're asked to do that as part of just the everyday of what it is to be in this space.
I have too much going on in my head at once to be able to think coherently about this question. I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate your thoughts into that question, Charlene, and your framing of it, and Molly and Kelly's answers. Yes, it's really complex. It's incredibly complex. I work with young people and older people, but in lots of different contexts. And I think moving through those contexts, it is sometimes complex. Students that I work with in a university setting, absolutely will. I can see exactly what Kelly means. They feel, and I can't. I want. It's early in the morning. The word tolerant is not the word I want to be using. That they're not more tolerant. They're more accepting. They're more open. They're more vocal about all of those things. About difference, about diversity, about what's important to them, about self-care. They have the language and the confidence to articulate that very clearly in the spaces when I'm working in university settings. There's a flip side to that. They're also less comfortable with discomfort or dis-ease. They don't like some of the things that Molly's just said about, and then Kelly echoed about drama workshops or theatre being able to make people think in different ways and put them out of their comfort zone to some extent. I see a resistance to that in classrooms. I see a very fast resistance to that. I'm uncomfortable with discussing that. I don't want us to be doing this as a class. And part of a learning process, I've always considered that you need to sit with the discomfort and the dis-ease in learning, because that's the way that you kind of change and you're critical of things sometimes. So those two things it isn't a binary, because those two things exist in a parallel environment. But then, having said that, when I'm not working in a university setting and I'm working with students, not students, when I'm working with young people who perhaps don't have the academic advantages and the socioeconomical privileges that allow them to be in the space as a student, but are in various different other contexts, I see less of that. I see less of the, in both ways. I think I see less of the vocal understanding of difference sometimes. I definitely see more ease with dis-ease in those spaces. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about, Charlene, about we're in bubbles. Our students or the young people we work with or the communities we work with are also very definitely in bubbles and silos. I see lots of silos. I feel like I'm moving through lots of different silos in my work life with different people thinking very differently. And I guess now I'm rambling, but I also want to say that you're absolutely right about drama and theatre. I think it has the potential to do all of that. Art in general, I think, has the potential to do all of the things that Kelly and Molly have just described so articulately and fluidly. But I think the number of people who have access to those spaces are also shrinking. We know that drama and theatre and the arts are shrinking in schools. And so I think less and less people have the opportunity to open the arts door or the drama studio door and be in those positions where they're being able to critically think through the arts or through drama. And that change. Is it a change? I think it's always been that way. We kind of go in circles, but we're in a very negative point in that circle. We're at the bottom of that circle where it feels that those opportunities are really being squeezed out. So that means that less young people will have those experiences that you talked about so brilliantly there, Molly, is my fear.
Yeah, I think I have exactly the same concern from the opposite side of the world. And I think that that is being borne out in terms of, it's a sort of, there's this odd kind of divergence between this huge emerging body of evidence now of all different sorts, from randomized control trials through to, very grounded case studies of practice that show the arts have a really important role to play in processes that we've talked about in terms of people relating across difference and, coming to, reflect on their own identities and their place in society. And at the same time that either actively through policy or through neglect, we're seeing access to participation in theatre and the arts, both in formal education and outside of that, declining, and funding for the arts declining and under threat. And I think that is really worrying, because that will then have an intergenerational impact, because we become socialized into participation in the arts. And if you lose people who are going to engage their children in everyday kind of arts craft activities, or get them involved in clubs, or just talk about and engage in arts themselves, then the next generation will be less inclined to do that, and less inclined to take those subjects and go on to be teachers of those subjects. And so yeah, I think we are at that kind of a sort of worrying, and I hate to use the word tipping point because that's probably a little bit overused at this moment in time, but it does feel a little bit like we could be at a tipping point in terms of entering into a kind of negative decline cycle. I don't know, that's very depressing.
It is depressing. I mean, I think there are two ways to wonder about this. Actually, there's probably 1,000 ways to wonder about this. That was a silly thing to say, sorry, but I'm wondering about this currently in two different ways. I mean, I think, and I feel very, I think concerned is a massive, all of the research that's coming out now, certainly from Australia, is similar to New Zealand, I imagine. And I know that the UK has been through this before, Selina, around the lack of university provision for arts, lack of funding around the arts, the cutting of courses, and all of these sorts of things. I think that we're living from an education point of view, and from a politics and policy point of view, we're living in a sort of a tyranny of usefulness moment, where unless you can really strongly argue the usefulness of your presence, it's considered distracting or problematic. And I think one of the really difficult things is that when I don't say usefulness there to mean benefit, I mean usefulness to a workforce effectively, or an economy. And so there's I'm in these kind of, I don't want us as a field to start to use the sort of rhetoric that positions what we do as useful to the economy, because I believe that we are so much more than that. But I think the other thing that on the other side, we could take a cynical point of view, I think, and wonder about the power structures, and wonder about the funding, and wonder about, and wonder if arts are being sidelined in society because they give people the sorts of complex perspectives and experiences that do not suit our current political climate, which is very much about simplifying message into what is very traditional right, wrong, good, evil sort of silos, that the arts has always, through the experiences that Molly just talked about, sought to break down. And so, I think there was a very wonderful keynote given by a playwright, Andrew Bavell, many years ago, like almost 20 years ago now, where he talked about drama becoming part of the curriculum in Australia. And he makes this point that When something moves from the margins to the centre, it loses its ability to be risky, right? And we very successfully, certainly in schools and in a lot of arts funding around major performing arts companies and the sorts of fundings that were associated with outreach and applied theatre, we very successfully moved to the centre. But I actually believe that being on the outskirts of that provides us an opportunity to be riskier as well, and to be spaces that aren't as heavily institutionalized, that allow a different kind of expression. So I do think that as much as I'm deeply concerned about that pathway and all of the things that Molly said, I do think there's also opportunity in those marginal spaces for us to consider the value of our work beyond its usefulness.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I guess the just to be the naysayer for a second again, it depends on access to those spaces and who has access and who is invited or feels that they can go into those spaces. I think the usefulness is an interesting. For a totally random reason, I had to look up how much the cultural industries makes economically in the UK yesterday. So I have the figure in my head. And the cultural industries, which is not a term that I enjoy or like or use very often in my life, in 2023 made £124 billion in the UK and employed 2.4 million people. So we can't argue on that level that the arts isn't useful, that theatre, drama, culture, and all of the things that are surrounded in that isn't useful, and yet we're still not shifting educational policy or drama provision isn't being shifted by that figure. But I don't want to leave with that, because actually I think you're right. There's a really interesting book by somebody called Justin, I want to say O'Connor, but I might have that wrong. I'm going to have to look it up in a minute. It's Justin O'Connor. It's just, I can see it. It's just there, which is called Culture is Not an Industry. And he says by using that term, we're devaluing in my head, I'm obviously translating culture into the drama and theatre worlds that we work in, and that we need to shift to be thinking about it in the same lines as we think about health policies or educational policies. It's a right, it's a public right, it's a civic engagement, all of the things that we would
It's
talk
a
about.
service
It's
as
a
well.
it's a service.
I mean, it is a service in the sense of it is of service to communities, it is of service to societies, right?
So I guess I fall in two camps. We can prove its usefulness. If we want to go down the cultural industries route, we can absolutely prove its usefulness. And you can't tell me that the government in the UK, New Zealand, Singapore, or Australia are blind to that fact. That it's a huge part of each country's economic growth. But that isn't enough to shift what's happening at the moment. So
I would say you've also.
Go on, Molly.
No, sorry, I've just got, because I've also got data coming out my ears, because I've been, it's when you end up at this point in the kind of political moment, you end up in continuous advocacy. And I find myself, because I'm an academic, of being the person who's like, right, I've got to have all the evidence, even though it might not be evidence that comes from paradigms that I necessarily, that I might critique. But I'm like, right, if I'm going to come out with my guns firing for the arts, I'm going to pull out some of the numbers. And, in the UK, there was a study that looked at the cost to the health system of if people didn't have access to museums, and just that kind of level of just going to see a fairly, going to a gallery, going to a concert, going to a museum, not even getting involved as a participant. And, they've quantified the cost to the NHS of people not having that access. And so, like you said, the data is clearly there, whether it's the contribution to the economy, the contribution to health and social outcomes, the contribution to educational outcomes. Maybe, I don't know as whether the outcomes there are so clear.
There are some very clear quantifiable outcomes around engagement with the
and then you've
arts
got the rights discourse. So I think there is a kind of, you get to a point where you think, well, there has to be some sort of willful ignoring of that to to continue to kind of erode the arts in education. And actually it becomes, I think you're right, it becomes a rights issue and it becomes an equity issue. Because because here, if you go to private school, you're going to learn a different musical instrument every year, you're going to take part in school productions, you're going to have, professional artists coming in and giving you your tuition. Or, if you've got the money, I can pay for my child out of school to go and have music lessons or whatever. And so then we get this huge, if those things then have educational, health, economic benefits, those benefits are accruing only with the people who can afford to access them.
I think you've touched on something that's really crucial, and that is a perpetuating, if not an increasing commitment to elitism.
Yes.
And elitism and the gap between the haves and the have-nots getting bigger and bigger. And that's not just the neoliberal economy, but a whole sense in which there is a capacity to believe I'm entitled to this. And if I can have it, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. So there's cost and there's consequence that's happening. And the kind of thinking that we're referring to in the applied theatre drama education space is asking for the complexity and the contradiction and the ambiguity and the plurality, all the things that you've articulated here, as a crucial part of literacy and building knowledge, which means questioning. And certainly in the Singapore context, this is a big question about whether or not this is providing the kind of education that is desirable. So yes, in the elite schools, you have this alternative experience, but they're for the chosen ones. But for the masses, this is sufficient. This is all they need. And don't make their life more difficult by bringing in all these other things, because really they just need to learn how to do X, Y, and Z. And that pervasiveness is, for me, part of an illiteracy that has grown in our societies, which claim to be educated. There's an illiteracy about what then is lost and the harsh consequences. So Singapore is also a significantly aging society. And what's happening is that now the arts is big one for helping with seniors. And, there's all the medical evidence there too. And that's one narrative that is growing, which is not a bad thing, of course. And the other is special needs. So there's relatively new and encouraging support for special needs schools, for community-based activities, for the arts, etc., in relation to a range of learning needs, neurodivergence, as well as physical disability, etc. But it's a kind of okay, let's make this a little bit special and a little bit sweet and bring out this sort of good feeling of how we're such a good society. But when it comes to a fundamental right, like you're saying, or a fundamental foundational building of space and access, we don't need it. Society's fine. And how to rethink this in all spheres, in the university, in schools, in social spaces, in policy think tanks, I'm flummoxed. I think it's like we need some kind of, I say that because I'm wondering if there's a kind of different way of thinking that we need to look to. If you're coming across that kind of, are there some different paradigms, ways of positioning the argument, positioning the work, bringing together different kinds of argument?
That's the key question, Charlene.
Which one? I asked a few.
What are the other ways as a field we can articulate what we do that doesn't play into the poles that we're talking about, or the fear of people that Kelly's right about the margins, like if you bring, but for me, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist because that's not my default position, but it absolutely feels that theatre has always been considered dangerous. To go back to 1642 censorship, it shows people different things. Books will do exactly the same thing, but it shows people different ways of doing things, whether you're watching something or you're doing it, and that can be dangerous. That if you create that feeling of empathy, of understanding the other, all of the stuff that you've talked about, the power of the things that theatre gives us critically and allows young people to think in different ways and to approach life in different ways, and perhaps take down some of those silos, it is a dangerous concept. So it's about how, I don't know the answer to your question, Charlene, about is there a different paradigm or different way of talking about it? There needs to be, but I don't know what that is. I think as a field we've tried, I don't want to sound too negative, but we've tried the economic value, we've tried the intrinsic human value, the rights value, we've got the evidence there, and we're just not shifting things. There's no disputing that the arts are good for people. We know that, but still nothing shifts. And I don't know what the answer. I don't know how we shift it to make the difference that we're all looking for and asking for on the kind of scale that we want it, which takes us back to being on the margins in the grassroots organizations, surreptitiously embedding critical thinking through drama in various different ways, but in a less mainstream way, and that's a good thing to be doing, but it doesn't shift. The Americans that I've worked with recently keep talking about shifting the needle, and it's stuck in my head. I don't know, it's a depressing thing to say. I don't know how we shift that needle, and I do see it as part of our jobs, as part of our lives in this field, to think about other ways of doing that. So if anybody else here has the way of doing that, teach me. I want to know how we can do that. Maybe it's not for us. Maybe it's the next generation. Maybe it's the people we're teaching that will do that for us.
I do think it's probably a long game. Sorry, Charlene.
Yeah. No, you go. Long game.
Do I think it's, well, it's a really hard question, right? Like that's a really hard question. Partly because it's so multifaceted, and partly because as a field, we don't necessarily have consensus on what success is going to look like. I mean, we can't assume that we are one thing and that we're all showing up for the same reason, right? A couple of just things to throw into the conversation rather than to answer anything. I do think that we are in a moment at the moment. And the moment at the moment, I can't believe I just said that when it was recording. Sorry, everybody. We are in a moment in institutions, political institutions, but also just institutions like school that have existed for however many decades and generations as they have always looked, that in the next 50 years will look different, right? We already see our media looking really different. The media that my kids consume is completely different from the media that I consumed, which, so I mean, in one generation, we've seen a massive shift in the way that media is produced and consumed and regulated. We're seeing a massive shift in our political institutions, in schools, AI, massive shift. We're going to see a massive shift in what we consider the role of the teacher to be, in how universities are asking questions like, how do we know if a PhD student knows what actually knows what they've submitted to us after 3 years, because they could have just gotten AI to generate that. So the whole things like being in person are going to become infinitely more important in some spaces, right? So we are in a moment where we're shifting. And so as we start to go, well, what do schools look like? And what is the role of knowledge? And what is it to demonstrate knowledge? And what's the importance of embodiment and presence when we've been slowly moving things away from that, but now effectively I could be an AI bot and you guys wouldn't know. I'm not, but I could be. And so those questions give us an opportunity, I believe. However, I also believe that it's going to be a long game, in that I think that we are also at a moment where it is going to take us a long time to come back and walk back from a lot of the things that we have taken for granted over many generations about how we should live. Like, we think about AI, and I know that certainly, Charlene, you and I, it was one of the questions that you and I were talking about earlier. AI could produce a situation where we go, this is fantastic. We have AI to do all of these menial tasks and all these procedural things. So we are going to provide everybody with the same pay and the same jobs, but knowing that AI has taken away a lot of the actual workload for some of their jobs, the more menial ones, we're just going to give them the space and the time to take longer at the rest. We're not going to increase their workloads. We're not going to expect them to do more. We're not going to reduce the size of our organization. Or, hey, we've got AI to reduce people's workload. Everybody should go to 4 days a week and have an extra weekend day, right? We could make that decision as societies and as organizations, but we're not culturally in a place in almost anywhere in the world where we will. And so I think the long game is actually the slow walk back from that, or away from it, not even back. We're not going back to anything. We're moving away from that treadmill that we have put ourselves on of needing to be constantly productive, constantly proving our usefulness as human beings, as academics, as people, constantly proving our worth and our deservedness, our deservedness to access, certain things. And so I think it's, in that sense, it's a massively long social cultural game, not a game issue. But I do think we are in this crazy opportunity moment right now. If we can harness it, and if we can think as a field about ways to start that shift away.
Yeah, because I think there's a point at which it is in that dark moment, as it were, that we have to ask some serious questions that we've not asked ourselves. And at the same time, I think it's really crucial to go back to something Molly said earlier about having a plurality of coexistent possibilities, which is part of the way in which our art form works, but it is sometimes not recognized as a way in which we need to keep on thinking that way and recognizing that, okay, so then we don't conclude, okay, we've done all this multiplicity and then we conclude with one nice, neat answer, right? Which tends to be a real danger in my part of the world, whereby it is very much tokenistic, this attention and question of inclusivity. It is not embedded in the crux of then what is valuable. It is almost seen as, okay, you can do all that to sort of satisfy this, but ultimately one message, one takeaway, which I really dislike that word when it is used. But nonetheless, I think this way of working with plurality, even in what we're talking about now, there seems to be a desire for simplistic answers. And we see this politically all around. There's a sort of a huge magnet pull, desire not to think. But having said that, I think there is also an exhaustion that creates that appeal. And I notice this in young people as well. So students are coming into class now halfway through the semester, tired like they used to be at the end of semester. And it's real exhaustion. It's not put on a pretend, they're good young people. They're earnest, they're there after all. And they're working through not enough sleep. They're working through the demands of multiple things, physical health, mental, emotional health. And they're coping with so many kinds of demands with little support that is effective in their terms. And this for me is a concern, because sometimes they come into the theatre space and we're just running minor study and electives. We no longer have our BA program and our MA program as a result of some of the larger decisions that are ongoing here. And they sometimes come into the space just to spend time with each other, just to be with their friends, and just to be able to have space to hear themselves think and feel and do something that is not in accordance with something outside them. They can go inside a little bit. So I find myself spending more time allowing for that inner journey, so to speak, so that they can feel it's worthwhile and less time needed to occupy them with content or whatever that used to be more important, so to speak. Hoping that this will motivate them to want to read and inquire and write something and not feel that AI is going to do it better, but that they will have something to say. And I feel that's my challenge, to really be able to cultivate curiosity to the point that they feel, no, I really want to say something because I had this experience and I have this perspective, and I feel that I need to be able to say it. That's so tough and
It's
so
but
valuable.
that coming together in a space more and more, I think, is the crux of what we do. I think in our one-to-one, I was talking about joy, and everybody in this room knows I've been talking about joy for a while. But
Joy as resistance, I must say.
Joy as resistance, but actually that comes out of that working with groups, whether that's in a prison setting or in a community setting or in an informal housing setting or at youth theatre, where just the joy of people coming together and being in a space with no pressures outside that space is part of the thing that I think that our discipline offers participants, whoever we're working with. And I think by giving them that space and then making that space, I don't want to use the word entertaining, but constructive, and in drama terms, I think does lead to what you're talking about there, Charlene. It does lead to an inquiring mind that wants to explore things because they've got the space to not be bombarded by everything else and to have conversations with each other, whether that's through tableaus and scripts or whether it's just through conversations. I think that space just to be is actually a huge part of what it is that we're all doing in our spaces that is important.
And how then to translate that into an understanding that will be sustainable, I think it is really, yeah. Molly, you were going to say something.
I was going to just echo that, and I think there is something that students are finding really compelling to be in the room for classes that are getting them to relate in kind of ways that are different to how they've been called on to relate in other educational spaces and systems. And I think sometimes they're quite surprised at that. And so we tend to get quite high attendance at kind of very participatory tutorials. Again, because they're being with each other, they're meeting people, they're making friends, they're not putting up their phones as a kind of defense from having to interact with anybody. They're making things together, and through that, starting to explore some, challenging ideas and content. So I think. And then the other thing I was going to say that I think where I find sort of hope probably amidst all of this and sort of countering the idea of it necessarily being a long game is there's always a kind of a counter movement and things that are happening. So one of those things I think that I don't quite know how to yet name it, but sort of unexpected allegiances and sort of unusual solidarities across sectors and spaces and groups that maybe normally might be sort of divided and sort of competing against each other for attention, identity, resource. You suddenly find people working together, and then really interesting, unusual new things emerging from those alliances. And I think there's a sense certainly across the arts sector, I think here, that people have just got fed up with having to compete against each other, build their own empires, and suddenly the sector has organized itself, and there's such a strong advocacy from within the arts sector, and I think that's come out, and that's something that's a strong position, I think, and you're seeing these kinds of levels of organization and parts of the sector working together in a way that's quite, I think some exciting things will come from. And similarly at a grassroots level, you seeing, you know, an organisation that's not an arts organisation, but with arts at its core, because, you know, sort of people have kind of fallen in together. I'm not articulating it very clearly, but I think things, maybe new things will emerge as these sort of unexpected alliances form. And within the university, you know, where people are collaborating across areas and suddenly something becomes something else because of sort of people who've sort of fallen in together, and something new gets developed that, yeah, anyway. So I think there are things happening. So I'm sort of, I think it's risky to get too much into, well, it's being alert to the fact of what's being eroded, and that's very real because you can count it and you can see it, but it doesn't mean it's gone away or that, you know, it's sort of, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to be too naive.
We had a conversation recently in relation to the art sector at a fringe festival that was crowdfunded for the first time in Singapore because it lost its title sponsor, right? And that was really quite significant. So one of the conversations was the loss of independent fringe spaces for experimental work in the performing arts industry in Singapore. And it was really valuable to recognize how, while there is a desire for a certain kind of ongoing fringe to happen that has a certain structure to it and a certain continuity, there's also what one person talked about as a nascent fringe, you know, things that are coming up in a more sporadic way, more random, not necessarily even detectable sometimes because it's just flying under the radar a little bit. And the question then became, okay, how do we then create these unusual solidarities? I really like that phrase actually, where there or the unexpected alliances, as it were, so that one doesn't have to all be coordinated and under one sort of umbrella, but nonetheless just being in touch with and in tune with allows for just a certain joy of resistance, to use Selina's phrase, and a certain satisfaction and hope that, okay, these things might find a different way to grow and flourish, perhaps. So the word sustainable then shifts its meaning into something else, perhaps.
I think this connects up with the whole conversation we were having earlier about, you know, what is it that moving away from the center that you gain, right? And, you know, to try and bring all of these sort of nascent and localized grassroots thing under one thing, it becomes more of a blunt instrument. Now it becomes potentially more politically powerful and certainly better funded. And I think we do need to be constantly arguing for that in that space. But also we need to have kind of capacity and support and the ability, the agility, I guess, as a field to allow for these unexpected alliances, for these new opportunities, for these new ways of working and thinking that align with what people in a particular space might need that's different from, or more risky or more experimental or whatever it is. I think that that's what brings strength as a field, right?
And it reminds me, Kelly, of something you said in our conversation about a million little moments. You were talking about teaching and how the teaching, you know, it's not just one thing and it's not just one major event, or it's a million little moments. And really in what we're talking about, it's also a million little moments in a million little spaces as well, not just in one domain, one location, but all those possibilities coming together in a million different ways. Just to add to that.
But it is
Yeah.
also because again, we often get into these ideas, there's a danger, and it's so prevalent in our society of us trying to simplify and the things to make them easily digestible, right? It is not a simple story that is linear. Our field is not. It's, you know, it's wild. It's out there doing millions of different things at any one time. Right now, as we are talking, there are millions, you know, of theatre programs, drama classes, you know, things happening all around the world in school halls and community centres, in prisons, in hospitals, on, you know, on street corners, wherever it is, all around the world. And I think that, yeah, it's easy to try and to channel it into our message that we can then use to explain what we do, to advocate for what we do. But I think that there's value in broadening it out too, and playing in that messiness, right? Like, you know, it's a play space. It's a global play space.
That's constantly evolving. I think that it doesn't stay the same ever. If you look back at the history, it's constantly changing, constantly developing, constantly shifting into different spaces in different ways. And I think that is one of the strengths of the field, the discipline, whatever we want to call it. But the intersection of communities and theatre or drama constantly shifts, and that is exciting still.
A global playground.
Nice.
I like that idea.
Or perhaps the kind of center of kind of new knowledge and practice production is going to shift to somewhere else for a bit. And that's actually going to could be really reinvigorating and useful. And it's, you know, to decenter that a little bit from some of the established traditions which have been critiqued and problematic, but not at the expense of people having access to classes and courses and curricula and stable, livable incomes, you know, that, yeah. So it's, you know, you don't want to lose one thing for the sake of another. I'm never going to excuse the kind of taking away of something because something else will grow up in the ashes. It's like, well, not really a good enough reason. Yeah.
We're not trying to solve anything in this 1 hour dialogue, much as we believe we should be able to. I don't want to take that away from us either. But I do want to say that I hope this conversation leads to further conversations, that this becomes a resource in all kinds of spaces, teaching spaces, thinking spaces, creative spaces, because in a way, I really appreciate that we've all got different ways of entering and playing with these ideas and issues and working with them through the knowledge, skills, capacities that we have and through the systems that we are part of. We're all involved in one form or another in different locations that have also enabled us to be at this point where we are now and be able to harness some of the resources and the supports that we've had access to thus far, and thus the desire for them to continue, the desire them to have other people be able to benefit from them and enjoy their possibility in different forms and guises. So I'm going to ask you each to say one final thing before we round up, as a final provocation, a final question that emerges, as a final thought for this conversation, not final in the big final sense, but just as a thought to leave us with and to linger with us so that we continue to think about this. We didn't get to everything that we planned to talk about, but nonetheless, I think we covered a good amount of ground. So, final musings.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and I'm sorry, this is only a half-formed final musing. I would like us to wonder, as a community, and as a community of scholars and practitioners, or just as people, as educators, as theatre makers, as friends, and how is it that the work that we do can contribute? Think about all of those wonderful things that Molly was talking about, the actual practice and the sorts of skills and ways of thinking that are brought about by doing this kind of work with people in a space. And connecting up with Selina's ideas about joy and joy as resistance as well. How is it that our work contributes to an understanding of being well in our society that privileges space, kindness, care, but also allows for what is often considered not well to be part of what it is to be well, and allowing us to have moments in our life where we are not moving forward, where we are doing things wrong, where we are not well, and seeing that as actually part of a cycle of well-being. That is not a problem. Something that we didn't get to talk about today, but I know that I've actually had conversations with, I think, everybody in this podcast about it separately. And I think that the fact that our work is connected, participatory, embodied, concerned with intersectionality and different perspectives, and concerned with giving space and time for creativity, I actually think we're well placed as a practice to be brought to bear on that kind of broader ideal, I guess. So that's something, if I go, what's the last thing that I would like to say? I would like to say, if this conversation is to continue for people, I would like to put that on people's radar.
Thank you.
Another big question, Kelly. You've just summed up a load of things really, really beautifully, and I've left no space for us to contribute in a very nice way. I guess that I guess my thing is I would like us in a similar different, I don't know. I think we're all, the four of us are now quite established, and I think that part of our field's role is for us to, we are part of institutions. They don't exist separately to us. We're part of them. They are part of us. And I think I think more and more I see the role of our field, but also individuals within that field, as needing to put our heads above the parapet more than we do, if that makes sense. Not just advocating. I think advocating is great. We need to do that. But I think the four of us are in a position to ask the difficult questions. And Charlene has posed difficult questions that have been very hard to think about at 7 o'clock in the morning. But I think as a field and as individuals within that field, we need to keep posing those difficult questions, and we won't have answers for them, but that's the point. Our field asks questions. It asks questions of the young people participating in a drama workshop. It asks questions of the people making that theatre on a street corner, and we need to make sure that we keep asking those questions in the places that they will be heard, and forcing them to be heard in places that they're not, if that makes sense. And so for people listening to the podcast, that's also your role. It's all of our roles. We need to keep asking those questions, not just advocating, but going to the hard places and asking the hard questions.
Thank you.
I just don't know if I can add anything that's sensible to what Selina and Kelly have just said. I am really interested in, so for this conversation, I think in some of the previous conversations, we've talked a bit about sort of the technological change and AI. And I think it's probably one of the things that I feel most unresolved about in my own kind of thinking and work. And I think I'm interested and excited by some of the things that are happening, where people are really going beyond some of the kind of technical questions or kind of public discourse that circulates all the time about AI. So Vanessa Mercado de Oliveira, I think I've got the name right, at 9 o'clock, who's been collaborating with and developing AI, but really exploring this as a kind of completely different kind of relationality. And where are the tiny places in which that can for her, it's about kind of delinking from modernity and the kind of aspects of modernity that are kind of destroying the planet. And whereas AI can be enrolled in that destruction, where are the glimpses of where these technologies might take us to somewhere else? And I find it so hard. I can't, all my ethical antennae go, no. And so I'm really interested in what if we follow that line of thinking, like where does it take us, and where are those possibilities, and how do we engage with them and engage our students with them and move beyond just the is this academic integrity issue, or is it going to undermine our jobs? It's like, actually, it's sort of, there's something else that's to do with being human and the future of the planet are the questions that I want to explore around that.
Wow, thank you. I think for me, building on what you've all said, and as part of my ongoing question is, how do we listen better in every sense of the word, with our bodies particularly, as an embodied listener? What does it mean to be present? But also in relation to all the different things that have emerged in this conversation and more, from the challenges of dealing with a fast-changing, technologized world to questions of wellness and responsibility to ourselves and to people with whom we work. The listening capacity, I think, has been impacted so badly. And I say this as someone who has, about a year ago, as you all know, I started wearing hearing aids because it became evident that this was something I needed. And there are so many implications for that. But it made me aware that we test our eyes, for example, on a regular basis, and the data shows we don't test our ears enough. So the question of listening with our beings and the impact of not being able to hear is very real. And I think for students and for academics and for people involved in the arts and education, which are the main spheres of work that I'm involved in, for me, the skill of listening and the time and space to honor that listening. And I appreciate all those who are listening to this right now, the three of us talking, four of us talking together, and then people interested enough to tune in and listen when they do. And so for me, I think part of the work that is a big question for me is, how do we enhance this practice and this skill in the ways that we've been talking about? On that note, we could go on, but I thank you so much. The day lies ahead for you, Selina. The day has come to an end for you, Molly. Kelly and I have a little bit more of a day left. Thank you all. Keep well, and I'll see you soon.